I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. Last year, Apple became the first US company to be worth $2 trillion. And what's even more remarkable is that it passed the $1 trillion mark just 2 years before that. It's hard to think of Apple as anything but a tech behemoth these days. The company behind the ubiquitous iPhone, the iPad, iTunes, MacBook computers, and so much more. But I wanted to take a closer look at the company and get an understanding of where it's come from and maybe where it's going. Stephen Fenech is one of Australia's top technology journalists and the editor and publisher of techguide.com.au. Stephen, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Let's start with the Apple story from the mid-70s, the two Steves, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Can you tell me about them?
Yeah, well, it's funny. The company was founded on April Fool's Day, 1976. So there's a bit of irony for you. But there was actually a third person. Ronald Wayne was the third founder, but he was bought out within the first month by the two other Steves. So looking back, he's probably thinking, opportunity missed there. But the two Steves knew each other, I think, from that local community. Sort of they were in Silicon Valley there together. Steve Wozniak, obviously a real computer whiz, and he was sort of the brains behind making the first Apple computer. Steve Jobs, still quite accomplished on the tech side, but he was more the entrepreneur, more the sort of the business side of things. Steve Jobs actually, he had jobs at Atari. He worked at Atari on the original Pong game. Would you believe he was employee number 40 at Atari? But also there's a famous story of Steve Jobs as well as a 12-year-old rang Hewlett-Packard looking for spare parts to make a frequency counter. And Bill Hewlett, the co-founder, actually answered the phone, and he was talking to him for a while, and he gave him the parts, but also offered him an internship. So that just sort of goes to show what sort of a person Steve Jobs was. He was this real go-getter who, combined with Steve Wozniak, they just had the perfect synergy to go forward and just totally change the world of computing, personal computing, and just create these legacy of products that we now look back on as being real game changers.
The first one was a Macintosh computer, which was probably early 80s. Was that the first big hit for them?
Well, that was the first that was the first computer that introduced the personal computer. A lot of people were hearing about computers, and they were these machines that filled up rooms, and you see them at NASA and all these big organizations. This was the first time that the computer was thought of as something you bring into your home. And that was kind of where they created the mouse. So the mouse was actually invented for the Macintosh computer. They created the GUI, the graphical user interface, so you can actually see what's on your screen, point to it with the mouse. So it's no longer learning lines of code. So really brought it to the customer rather than being offered to the computer experts. That's really what set Apple apart, is that they thought of the customer. Let's make it easy for the customer. And Macintosh in 1984 was the one that they took off with that product and followed it with the iMac, the iPod in the early 2000s. The iPod was announced 1 month after 9/11. Steve Jobs stood up with the original iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket, totally revolutionized how we listen to music. And then, of course, the iPhone just turned the smartphone market on its head. iPad did the same. Apple Watch is now a medical-grade device. It's just recently been approved as an ECG. So these tentpole occasions there where Apple has totally changed the industry with their products.
And you mentioned they thought about the customer, and that's in the interface with the technology, but also design. Apple is beautiful.
Absolutely, yeah. Steve Jobs and his biography, by the way, Walter Isaacson's biography is a brilliant book about what Steve Jobs, what he was thinking and his whole character and how his real attention to detail. I think his father was a mechanic, his adoptive father. And I remember there was a story in the book where they were making some kind of cupboard or something. And the back of the cupboard, his father was still painting and making sure it looked really nice. And Steve said, well, no one's going to see that. So why would you even bother doing that? His father said, look, I'm going to know that it's not right, so I want to make it perfect. And that's something that really stuck with Steve. And so design, ease of use became something of a push forward for him to make this sort of so stand out from the crowd. And his collaboration through the years with all the designers making these products not only work good, but look good as well, that was at the forefront.
We hear so much good stuff about Apple, but they did have a couple of flops, didn't they?
They had several. There's been many products that really were good ideas at the time, but were total failures. I think one of the early ones was the Newton. Remember, this was a machine. This was a product that was years ahead of its time. It was this device. It was the message pad that had the handwriting recognition, and was so bad that it just completely failed. They even parried it on The Simpsons. The Simpsons had a little joke with them as well. That was a spectacular failure. But others moving forward, they have had others. Back in 2010, I think it was, they had an idea to create a social media for the music industry called Ping. That was an idea recently. That went nowhere. They've also had some computers. I think one of their Mac Pros, the square-shaped computer, that didn't do anything either. There was a good idea at the time, but didn't go anywhere. But while we remember Apple's successes, of course, there were these little failures along the way that I think helped make them a better company. They learned from those experiences, then moved forward with those learnings to make their next product even better.
Stephen, stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. My guest today is Stephen Fenech, editor and publisher at techguide.com.au. And of course, Steve Jobs built the company with Steve Wozniak. Those two had a falling out, and Steve Jobs actually left the company, but then the board asked him back.
Yeah, I don't think he left. I think he got kicked out. He was unceremoniously escorted out because there was a disagreement with the board. I think the CEO at the time was a former boss of Pepsi. So there was all this friction there. He went off to create Next Computing, which a couple of years later, Apple would buy their IP to create their next operating system. So when Steve was gone, the company was in real trouble, was almost on the verge of bankruptcy in the late 90s. So when Steve came back, it was like the second coming. When he came back, that's when the next iMac they created was the new, remember the see-through iMac that had the back of it was a bit see-through, had all these different colors. That was the beginning of the resurgence of Apple because Steve Jobs was there. I think he was known as the temporary CEO or whatever his title was at the time. He then created the iMac and then would go on to do the iPod and all of these other great devices that now stand as these iconic products.
I mean, Steve Jobs died, very untimely death. He was very young when he died. And of course, people were scared that Apple couldn't survive without Steve Jobs. But it just seems to have gone, well, from strength to strength, to be honest.
The thing with Steve Jobs, a lot of his vice presidents were also very talented in their own areas of the company. And the one in particular was Tim Cook, the current CEO. At the time, he was the chief operating officer who ran the company like a Swiss watch. And in terms of getting stock around the world, I think one of the big things when Steve came back to Apple in the late 90s, they had this unmanageable range of products that he just cut down to like half a dozen products, going from 20, 30 products, really streamlined their product lineup. And that helped them as well. But Tim Cook has always been in the background and always really, really figured prominently in their success in the background. And he was just, I think, a great choice as CEO to take it forward. But I think Steve Jobs was the kind of visionary who had ideas and a roadmap for the company that I think they're still looking at right now. It's nearly 10 years ago since he died. I still think they've got his ideas and all of his roadmap that he probably left before he died, all these great ideas he had still in place.
So if you look at Apple now, is it a tech company primarily or is it a marketing company primarily?
Well, that's one thing about Apple. They are a tech company. They're a real innovative company and they make great products. But Apple have just got this real knack of packaging their products and marketing their products. I've been to enough keynotes. I've seen Steve Jobs present new products live. You watch how they present their products. Everything's gorgeous. Everything's the best. Everything is beautiful. Everything. You listen, you can play Apple Bingo with next time they have a keynote. All these great words that they use, they treat their products with reverence. And that's what the customers do. If they're talking about it like that, the customers are thinking the same way. And Apple's come to a point now where it's not official until Apple does it. A recent example I'll give you is when they released the iPhone 12 a few months ago, it was the first 5G iPhone. So first iPhone that had 5G, and everyone thought, how good's this, 5G? Samsung had 5G for 2 years, but everyone thought, well, okay, Apple's doing it, it must be real. That's the sort of company they are. The customers think if Apple's doing it, it must be right. It must be fair income because Apple's doing it. That's the power they've got.
We'll be back in a moment. I'm talking to editor and publisher at techguide.com.au, Stephen Fenech. It's a $2 trillion company. Biggest company in the world was late last year, though its share price has dropped a little. Does it just keep growing, do you think? Has it reached saturation point? What do you reckon will happen in the next couple of years?
I think they've got a long way to go. You think what they've got now, everyone's going to be using phones, tablets, they're going to improve computers. They're all getting better, faster, more useful. But the big push with Apple, I think, too, a couple of areas. One, the big rumor is they're going to enter the motoring space. So there's an Apple car rumored to be created in conjunction, I think, in partnership with Hyundai or Kia, one of those South Korean companies. So there's a development for a car OS. There's also rumors they're going to have the virtual reality headsets, all these other products they've got in the back of their mind, but also, too, their services are also taking off. Apple Pay, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus. These are parts of the company. If you look at their financial records, these are the parts of the company that are growing, that are earning more money than a lot of the hardware in some cases. So they've got all these areas of the business that are doing really well. And with the services business also taken off, everyone's streaming. We're all paying now with our iPhones and Apple Watches. These are the services that's going to even propel Apple even further. And who knows when we're going to see an Apple car, but the rumors are just too strong to ignore that they're working in this industry. So you can imagine they're going to have their fingers in a lot of pies in a lot of industries, including the car industry, including the entertainment industry, including the computer industry. So I've just named 3 industries that are probably some of the most lucrative in the world right now and will continue to be.
Do you think that Apple has a rival? I mean, it's got lots of rivals. It's got Spotify. It's got streaming services like Netflix. It's got watches. It's got Samsung. It seems to have a lot of rivals. Does it have a main rival or is it unique?
Its main rival I'd see would be Samsung, just in terms of Samsung's sheer breadth as a company. Like Samsung, they make phones, they make computers, not as popular as Apple. They make tablets, but they also make appliances, smart products. They own Harman, which is the motoring side of Harman Kardon. So they've got all these other investments as well. So they've got audio, they've got tech covered as well. I'd say probably Samsung would be their biggest tech rival. But as you said, they do have rivals in music. So they've got Spotify, they've got rivals with Apple TV Plus, they've got Netflix, Disney Plus. So sheer tech rivalry, I'd say Samsung, perhaps even Microsoft to a degree. Microsoft, in terms of innovation lately, have been doing very well with their Surface computers, their Surface laptops. They're sort of really coming forward as well. So I'd say probably Samsung would be the biggest rival, probably closely followed by Microsoft and also Google. Google also being a big company in terms of their sheer connectivity. The search engine's one thing, but they've also got a lot of services as well. Google Play Store, Google Workplace, which is cloud-based productivity tools. So, yeah, pretty solid rivalry, but Apple, though, they seem to have all the pieces in the right place and I think are well ahead of the rest.
You look at these technology companies and watch what's happening. It must be incredibly exciting because I don't think the pace of change will slow. I think it will accelerate.
My fascination is never ceases. I think, what more could they possibly think of? This is me thinking this. I've seen tech for the last 20 years and every time I'm still constantly surprised by the innovation, things that we haven't even thought of, that people like Steve Jobs, Apple, and these visionaries that work at these companies that are just continually innovating. And the competition amongst these companies, that's what's driving the innovation, because there's going to become a point where one needs to stand out from the other, because we're seeing now all this technology that was 3 years ago, flagship product 3 years ago, is now your entry-level and mid-level product. So these companies still need to innovate to still get people to pay $2,000 for a phone, $3,000 for a laptop. That's the challenge, I think, moving forward, how they're going to continually innovate and keep customers paying the sort of money they are for their products.
Do you know what Steve Wozniak's doing nowadays? Occasionally you see him on almost B-list celebrity shows. I hate to say that, but I haven't heard from him for a while.
Oh, you see him, he's a talking head. I think he's great on TV whenever there's an issue with what would have Steve Jobs done in this situation. I've seen him in a few. I've actually met him at a Mac show a few years ago. But he's a really interesting guy who's still fascinated by technology. He's doing pretty well, I think, with his Apple stock nowadays. So he's living an easy life. But he's still very involved, though, in the industry. And he's one of those sort of, he's like a guru who can comment on latest tech issues and where the technology industry is going.
Stephen, I think you're a really nice bloke because I actually once sat next to him at a dinner. He was one of the oddest guys I've ever spoken to. A genius, no doubt, but he's a bit left of centre.
He is a little bit, but, I think they did have a campaign years ago. Remember that Think Different campaign?
Yeah.
The voiceover was actually done by Steve Jobs himself. There's a line in it that says, people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world often are the ones that do. So I think that sort of sums up him as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Stephen, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot, mate.
That was Stephen Fenech, editor and publisher at techguide.com.au. That's techguide.com.au.